The scratching stopped the exact moment I pressed my ear against the cold plaster of the bedroom wall. It was an abrupt, jarring silence that felt louder than the noise it replaced. But the other sound, the one that had driven me from my bed in a cold sweat, persisted. It was a low, wet whisper, a sibilant hiss of air and saliva that seemed to be originating from inside the wall itself, impossibly close. It sounded like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of water, a constant, unreadable murmur that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up, prickling my skin despite the sweltering summer heat. This nightmare began subtly, as most do. It was about a month after the new couple moved into the adjoining semi-detached house. Our homes were old, built in an era when privacy was an afterthought, and we shared a party wall that was notoriously thin. We'd learned to live with the muffled sounds of our previous neighbors, a blaring television, the occasional argument, the laughter of their children. It was the white noise of communal living. But this was different. It started with a faint tapping. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling, or perhaps the new owners, a quiet and reclusive pair I'd only seen in passing, hanging pictures. I'd be lying in bed, on the cusp of sleep, and I'd hear it tap, 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 tap. It was gentle, almost polite, but it was always there, night after night, originating from the same spot right behind the headboard of our bed. My wife, Sarah, a deep sleeper, heard nothing. It's just the pipe's love. She'd mumble, rolling over and pulling the duvet tighter around her. I tried to believe her. For a week, I convinced myself it was plumbing, or a loose bit of siding rattling in the wind. But the tapping grew more insistent, the rhythm less random. It began to feel less like a noise and more like a signal. Then, one night, the sound changed. The gentle tapping was gone, replaced by a dry, frantic scratching. It was a horrible, skittering sound, like trapped rats scrabbling at drywall, but with an unnerving intelligence to it. It would start and stop, moving up and down the wall in short, agitated bursts. It was the sound of something desperate to get in or out. That was when the real fear began to take root. Sleep became a battleground. I'd lie awake for hours, my body rigid, listening to the incessant scratching just inches from my head. I started sleeping on the couch, telling Sarah my back was acting up. The truth was, I couldn't bear the proximity to that wall. The couch was no better. The sound was fainter from the living room, but I could still feel the vibrations through the floorboards, a low, constant hum of activity from the other side. Then came the whispers. It was during one of my sleepless nights on the couch that I first heard it. The scratching had paused, and in the profound silence of 3 a.m., a new sound bled through the plaster, a low, guttural murmur. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was so faint I thought I was imagining it in my sleep, deprived brain manufacturing phantoms. But as I strained to listen, it came again, a long, drawn-out exhalation of sibilant, liquid sounds. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was one of pleading, of pain. I finally broke down and told Sarah everything. I explained the progression from tapping to scratching, and now to the whispers. She held me, her expression a mixture of concern and skepticism. "Maybe you should see someone, Mark," she suggested gently. "You're so stressed from work. Your mind could be playing tricks on you." Her words, meant to be comforting, felt like a betrayal. I wasn't crazy. I knew what I was hearing. Her doubt, however, planted a seed of its own. Was I losing my mind? Driven by a need for validation, I became obsessed. I'd spend hours at night with a glass pressed to the wall, trying to decipher the whispers, trying to make sense of the scratching. One evening, while working late in my home office, which also shared the party wall, further down from our bedroom, the scratching started with a renewed frenzy. It was louder, more desperate than ever before. I stood up, my pulse thudding in my ears, and pressed my ear to the cold wall. This time, beneath the frantic scraping, I heard a new sound, a soft, pitiful whimpering like a small dog in agony. A wave of concern, stronger than my fear, washed over me. What if someone was hurt? What if they were keeping an animal in there and abusing it? My imagination ran wild with terrible possibilities. I had to know. I went outside, the cold night air a shock to my system, and walked around to their side of the house. The entire property was dark, save for a single, dim light in what I assumed was their living room. Their bedroom window, the one that should have backed onto my office, was pitch black. My hand trembled as I knocked on their front door. After a long moment, it opened a crack. The man I'd only ever seen from a distance stood there, silhouetted against the dim interior light. He was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes that made them look sunken. A nervous tick pulsed at the corner of his eye. "Yes?" he asked, his voice a dry, toneless rasp. I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm Mark, your neighbor. I heard some strange noises. Some scratching and what sounded like whimpering. I wanted to make sure everything was all right." His eyes, which had been darting around nervously, locked onto mine. A flicker of something, fear, anger, passed through them before being replaced by a strained, unconvincing smile. "The house?" he said, his voice flat. "It's old, makes all sorts of sounds. Just settling." He didn't open the door any wider. It sounded like an animal. I pressed, my concern overriding my fear of confrontation. "Are you sure you don't have a pet in there that might be trapped or something?" His smile vanished. "We have no pets," he stated, his tone suddenly cold and final. "Thank you for your concern." He closed the door firmly in my face. I stood on his doorstep for a long moment, the silence of the night pressing in on me, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and a deep, primal dread. He was lying. I knew he was. The noises intensified after that night. It was as if my inquiry had provoked them. The scratching became a constant, maddening companion, and the whispers grew louder. One night I was jolted awake not by a sound, but by Sarah shaking me, her face pale in the moonlight filtering through our window. "Mark, listen," she hissed, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. I held my breath. The whispering was no longer a faint murmur. It was a clear, sibilant stream of unintelligible words, flowing from the wall like a fall vapor, and beneath it a new sound had joined the chorus. A soft, rhythmic, wet thudding. Thump, 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 thump. It sounded sickeningly like a heartbeat, or, more accurately, like something heavy and damp being repeatedly, methodically, beaten against the wall. We lay there, frozen in our bed, for what felt like hours, listening to the symphony of horror from the other side. Sarah's doubt had evaporated, replaced by a visceral fear that was far worse than my own had been. The next morning, neither of us had to say a word. I called the non-emergency police line. 2 officers arrived that afternoon. They were polite but dismissive, their expressions betraying their belief that this was a trivial neighborly dispute. They spoke to the couple next door first, who were apparently charming and cooperative. Then they came to us. "Sir, ma'am," the older officer said, "your neighbors assure us everything is fine. They're renovating, which might explain some of the noise. They seem like quiet people." We didn't find anything to suggest otherwise. The feeling of being utterly alone, of being the only sane person in an insane world, washed over me. The police left, and we were left with the wall. That night, the sounds were gone. A profound, unnerving silence filled our home. For a week, there was nothing. We started to relax, to hope that the police visit had scared them into stopping whatever it was they were doing. Then, one Saturday morning, we woke up to find their house empty. Their car was gone. There was no moving truck, no for sale sign, no goodbye. They had simply vanished, as if they had never been there at all. The relief was immense, intoxicating. We reclaimed our bedroom, slept soundly for the first time in months, and began to feel normal again. But the silence didn't last. About a month later, I was reading in bed when I heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible, like a memory echoing in the quiet. The whisper. It was back. I froze, straining to hear, praying I was imagining it. But Sarah heard it too. Her hand found mine in the darkness, her grip ice cold. The whispers continue to this day. They are fainter now, more distant, but they are undeniably there. And sometimes very late at night, when the house is still and the world outside is asleep, we hear a new sound. It's a soft, rhythmic dragging from the other side of the wall. A heavy, intermittent scraping, as if something cumbersome is being slowly, painstakingly pulled across the floorboards. We never press our ears to the wall anymore. We don't want to know, but we both know that they never truly left, or at least that something of them remains. And the most terrifying part, sometimes, mixed in with the old, wet whispers, we think we can hear a third voice, a new addition to the chorus, a voice that sounds faint and pained and sickeningly familiar. The terracotta pot felt unnaturally heavy in my hands as I tipped it over. the dry soil and roots tumbling onto the spread out newspaper with a dusty thud. It was the bones that made me do it. Not the ones I expected, but the one I found by accident. A small, bleached, white splinter of a thing, poking out of the dark soil like a deformed mushroom. It was curved with a distinct, tiny ridge along its edge. It looked, to my horror-stricken mind, exactly like a piece of a human finger. The sight of it, nestled amongst the roots of those dark, velvety succulents, sent a wave of icy dread through me that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. It had all started so innocently, so neighborly. It began with Mrs. Henderson's garden. She lived next door in a quaint little cottage, and her garden was the envy of the entire street. It was a riot of color and life, a meticulously curated Eden that stood in stark contrast to my own patchy lawn and neglected flower beds. I'd often see her out there, a wide, brimmed hat on her head and a trowel in her hand, humming softly as she tended to her prize, winning roses and exotic-looking ferns. She seemed like the perfect neighbor, quiet, pleasant, and possessing a green thumb that bordered on magical. One sunny Saturday afternoon, she approached me at the fence that separated our properties. Her smile was warm, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Good morning," she'd chirp. "I was admiring your rosemary bush. It's wonderfully wild. I was hoping you might spare a cutting for my herb garden." She gestured to a large, overgrown rosemary bush that was one of the few things thriving in my yard through sheer neglect. "Of course," I said, flattered by the attention. "Oh, wonderful," she beamed. "I won't take it for nothing, of course. I have a lovely young hydrangea that needs a new home, and some rather unique succulents I think you'll adore. A little garden swap, what do you say?" It seemed like a wonderful idea, a chance to add a bit of her horticultural magic to my own sad patch of earth. The following weekend, we made the exchange. She carefully dug up a section of the rosemary, handling it with a reverence I found charming. In return, she presented me with a healthy-looking hydrangea, which I planted near my back patio, and a small terracotta pot containing a cluster of the most unusual succulents I had ever seen. Their leaves were a deep, dusky purple, almost black, with a texture like velvet. They were strangely beautiful, and I placed them in a prominent spot on my front doorstep. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. The hydrangea took root, and the succulents seemed to thrive in their shady spot, their dark leaves a striking contrast to the cheerful red of my front door. The first oddity was my cat, Jasper, a normally fearless hunter who patrolled the yard with an air of feline authority. He suddenly refused to go near the front of the house. He would sit at the threshold of the living room, staring at the front door, his back arched and a low, guttural hiss rumbling in his chest. If I tried to coax him out, he'd recoil as if from an invisible barrier. Then came the smell. It was a cloying, sickly, sweet odor that seemed to emanate directly from the succulents. It was most potent in the evenings, a heavy, cloying perfume that reminded me of overripe fruit and damp earth. I tried moving the pot, thinking it might be reacting poorly to the paint on the door, but the smell persisted, clinging to the air around it. The first dead bird appeared a week later, a sparrow lying on the welcome mat right beside the pot. Its body was perfectly intact, no signs of a struggle or an attack from a predator. Its eyes, however, were wide open, filmed over with a milky, opaque glaze. I felt a pang of sadness and revulsion as I scooped it up with a trowel and buried it in the backyard. I chalked it up to a sad, random occurrence. But the next morning, there were two more, a finch and a robin, arranged in almost the same spot, their bodies stiff, their eyes clouded over. A cold knot of unease began to form in my stomach. Over the next 2 weeks, the area around my front door became a miniature graveyard. Squirrels, which used to chase each other playfully across my lawn, vanished. My own small herb garden, which had been struggling but alive, suddenly withered and turned black overnight, every plant dead, as if poisoned. The air around the succulents felt heavy, stagnant, and wrong. I finally decided to mention it to Mrs. Henderson. I caught her pruning her roses, her movements as graceful and precise as ever. "Mrs. Henderson," I began, trying to sound casual, "a strange thing has been happening. Those succulents you gave me, they're beautiful, but everything around them seems to be dying." She paused, snippers in hand, and looked at me. Her smile was as bright as ever, but her eyes held a strange, knowing intensity. "Oh yes," she said, her voice a pleasant, musical chime. "They are a very rare species, quite particular. They have very specific nutritional requirements." Her vagueness was more unsettling than any explanation could have been. I went home and spent hours searching online for dark, leafed velvety succulents, but nothing I found matched the plants on my doorstep. I found articles about toxic plants, plants that could sicken animals, but nothing that seemed to kill with such silent, passive efficiency. The final straw came on a crisp autumn evening. I was sitting in my living room reading when I heard a frantic scrabbling at the front door. I looked up to see a small field mouse, clearly disoriented, running in frantic circles on my welcome mat before collapsing right beside the terracotta pot. It twitched once, twice, and then lay still. Its death was almost instantaneous. That was it. I couldn't stand it a moment longer. Those plants had to go. I pulled on a pair of thick gardening gloves, my heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and resolve. As I reached for the pot, my fingers brushed against the soil, and I felt something hard and sharp just beneath the surface. It was the bone. The small, curved, sickeningly familiar piece of bone. My breath hitched in my throat. I carried the pot to the back of the yard, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. I laid out several sheets of newspaper and, with trembling hands, appended the pot. The dark soil, the tangled roots, and a shower of small, white objects tumbled out. There were dozens of them. Tiny, delicate bones from birds, mice, and what looked like a squirrel's jaw. They were the silent testament to the pot's lethal aura. And then, amongst the animal remains, I saw it again. The bone fragment that had started it all. I picked it up with my gloved fingers, my stomach churning. It was undeniably bone, and it looked chillingly like the distal phalanx of a human finger. I dropped it as if it were burning hot. I didn't even think. I scooped the entire mess, soil, plants, bones, and all, into a heavy, duty trash bag, sealed it tight, and drove to the local police station. I must have sounded like a lunatic, rambling about killer succulents in my neighbor's garden, but the sight of the bones was enough for them to take me seriously. The investigation was quiet and ultimately fruitless. A forensic analysis confirmed the animal bones, but the single fragment I believed to be human was deemed inconclusive. It was too small, too degraded. It was possibly human, but they couldn't be certain. The police spoke to Mrs. Henderson. She was the picture of a sweet, confused old lady. She claimed the succulents were a gift from a relative who traveled, and she had no idea they were toxic. She expressed deep sorrow over the dead animals. There was no evidence of any wrongdoing. The case was closed. Mrs. Henderson continued to hum in her perfect garden, her roses blooming more vibrantly than ever, but I could no longer see the beauty. I saw only the darkness beneath the surface. I built a taller fence. I avoided her gaze. Then, just last week, I was taking out the trash when I saw it, nestled at the base of her most magnificent, award-winning rose bush, a single dark-leafed succulent, identical to the one she had given me, its velvety leaves a stark contrast to the bright red petals. It looked healthy, thriving. And as the morning sun hit it just right, I saw something glinting in the dark soil beneath it. Something small and white. I didn't need a closer look to know what it was. Her garden, I realized with a sudden, soul-crushing certainty, had always had very specific nutritional requirements. And the sickly sweet smell, the one I thought had vanished, has started to drift over my new, taller fence on the evening breeze, a constant, chilling reminder of the swap and of the secret she buries to make her garden grow. The silhouette was what woke me. Not a sound, not a nightmare, but the primal, instinctual feeling of being watched. I was on the couch, having fallen asleep with the television murmuring, and in that disoriented, pre-dawn state, my eyes were drawn to the window. Across the street, framed perfectly in the dusty second-story window of the old gable house, was the dark shape of a man. He was perfectly still, a stark, black cutout against the deeper black of the abandoned home's interior. My heart, which had been beating in a slow, sleepy rhythm, kicked into a frantic gallop. The gable house, or the widow's place, as we'd all called it since old Mrs. Gable passed away 5 years ago, was a neighborhood relic. It was a handsome but decaying Victorian that had sat empty and boarded up for as long as I'd lived on this street. The paint was peeling, the porch was sagging, and a thick layer of dust coated every window pane. It was a dead house, and yet there was a man standing in its window. My first thought was that I was still dreaming. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, expecting the phantom to be gone. He was still there, unmoving, a silent sentinel in the gloom. I slid off the couch, my stockinged feet silent on the hardwood floor, and crept closer to my own window, my body trembling. I peered out from behind the edge of the curtain, using the darkness of my own unlit living room as cover. The weak, flickering glow of the single streetlight on our corner cast just enough orange light to illuminate his profile. He was tall, unnaturally so, with a gaunt, skeletal frame. His face was sharp and angular, all harsh lines and deep, set shadows where his eyes should be. And he was looking directly at my house, not just at the house, but at me. I felt his gaze like a physical touch, a cold pressure against my skin. Who was he? A squatter? A vandal? The front door was boarded over with thick plywood, the ground floor windows likewise. How could anyone have gotten inside without making a sound? My mind raced trying to find a logical explanation, but my gut was screaming a simpler, more terrifying truth. This was wrong. This was dangerous. My hand shook so badly I could barely unlock my phone. I fumbled through my contacts and dialed the non-emergency police number, my voice a strained whisper as I explained the situation. "There's a man," I said, my eyes still locked on the figure in the window, "in the abandoned house across the street. He's just watching my house." The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, but I could sense the undercurrent of routine. This was probably just another spooky house call for them. She assured me a patrol car would be dispatched to investigate. As I hung up, a new wave of fear washed over me. The police would take minutes to arrive, minutes in which I was a fish in a bowl, completely exposed to the silent watcher across the street. I scrambled to turn off the living room lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The sudden change made the silhouette across the street seem even more defined, more menacing. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I felt hunted. I moved through my house like a ghost, peering out of the kitchen window, then the upstairs bedroom window, trying to see if he had moved, but the angle was wrong. Yet, the feeling of being watched never left me. It was a tangible presence, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck that followed me from room to room. Finally, the distant wail of a siren broke the suffocating silence. It grew steadily louder, a comforting sound that promised intervention, an end to this waking nightmare. I rushed back to the living room window, just in time to see the patrol car pull up. 2 officers got out, their flashlights cutting sharp, white beams through the murky darkness. They approached the widow's place cautiously, their beams sweeping across the boarded-up door and windows before landing on the second-story window where the man had been. It was empty. The window was just a dark, dusty square again. The man was gone. My stomach plummeted. The officers spent a few minutes checking the perimeter, their flashlights probing the shadows, confirming that the boards were all secure. There was no sign of entry. After a few minutes, one of the officers walked across the street and knocked on my door. "Sir," he said, his expression a mixture of professional politeness and wary skepticism. "We did a full check of the property. Everything is secure. No signs of forced entry, and we couldn't see anyone inside. Are you sure you didn't just see a shadow? The way the branches move in the streetlight can play tricks on your eyes." "No," I insisted, my voice shaking with frustration. "He was there. He was tall, thin, he was watching me." I sounded hysterical even to my own ears. The officer gave me a sympathetic nod that felt entirely condescending. "Well, there's no one there now. We'll keep an eye on the place, but it was probably just a trick of the light. Try and get some rest." He left, and the comforting presence of the law drove away, leaving me alone again with the oppressive silence in the dark, empty house across the street. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every creak of my own house, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept all the lights on, a futile gesture of defense against a threat I couldn't see. In the days that followed, I became obsessed. I couldn't stop looking at the gable house, my eyes constantly scanning its dark, vacant windows, half dreading, half expecting to see him again. I started to doubt myself. Had the officer been right? Was I so stressed, so tired, that my mind had conjured a boogeyman from shadows and moonlight? For 3 weeks, there was nothing. The house remained a silent, decaying monolith. I started to relax. I convinced myself it had been an aberration, a hallucination born of exhaustion. Then, on a Tuesday evening, during a heavy downpour, I saw him again. The rain was lashing against my windows, the world outside a blurry watercolor of gray and black. I was making dinner, glancing out the kitchen window, when my blood ran cold. He wasn't on the second floor this time. He was on the ground floor, his face pressed right up against the grimy glass of a side window that wasn't boarded up. The rain streamed down the pane, distorting his features, but it couldn't hide his eyes, which were fixed on me with a terrifying intensity. And this time, there was something new. A detail that shattered my last hope of this being a misunderstanding. A faint, unnerving smile was playing on his thin lips. It was a smile of pure, predatory malice. I dropped the knife I was holding. It clattered to the floor as I scrambled for my phone, my fingers slipping on the screen. I dialed 911. This time, there was no calm explanation. I was babbling, hysterical, telling the dispatcher that he was back, that he was smiling at me. The police response was faster, more urgent. 2 cars arrived, sirens blaring. They surrounded the house, guns drawn. This time, they didn't just look. They used a crowbar to pry the boards off the front door and stormed inside. I watched from my window, my body shaking uncontrollably, as their flashlight beams danced through the empty rooms. They emerged 20 minutes later, their expressions grim. They found nothing. The house was empty. There were no footprints in the thick dust, no signs that anyone had been inside for years. They found no way a person could have gotten in or out without leaving a trace. The second police interview was different. They were no longer just skeptical, they were concerned. For me, they asked if I was on any medication, if I'd been under a lot of stress, if I lived alone. They suggested, gently, that I might be experiencing something psychological. I was the crazy neighbor seeing things. My reality was officially invalidated. I live in a state of constant, low-grade terror now. The Gable house sits across the street, a monument to my decaying sanity. I still see him, but not as clearly. A flicker of movement in a window. A shape that vanishes when I look directly at it. I've installed blackout curtains, but it doesn't help. The feeling of being watched is a permanent fixture in my life, and the horror has changed. It's no longer just across the street. A few weeks ago, I started hearing sounds in my own house. Faint scratching sounds coming from inside the attic late at night. The soft creak of a floorboard upstairs. When I know I'm the only one home. I don't know if he's a man or a ghost or a figment of my imagination. But I know that smile was real, and I have a terrible, creeping suspicion that he's not just watching from the window anymore. I think he's finally found a way to cross the street. My hands, slick with sweat inside my gardening gloves, gripped the cold aluminum rungs as I made my final, careful descent. The massive oak tree in Mr. Abernathy's yard loomed over me, its newly trimmed branches a testament to a job well done. The ladder I was on was a monstrous thing, an extension ladder that felt like it belonged to a team of firefighters, and it was the only reason I'd been able to reach the dead limbs, threatening my roofline. I had borrowed it 2 days ago from Mr. Abernathy, my reclusive and perpetually grumpy neighbor. Now, with the job finished, I was just glad to have my feet back on solid ground. I leaned the ladder against the trunk of the oak, intending to haul it back across the lawn that separated our properties and return it immediately. Mr. Abernathy wasn't a man you kept waiting. He was a creature of strict, unyielding routine, and borrowing anything from him had felt like negotiating a complex international treaty. As I turned towards his small, meticulously kept brick house, I noticed something that made me pause. His back door, the one leading from his kitchen to his small, paved patio, was ajar. Just a crack, a dark vertical slash in the clean white paint. It was a small detail, but for Mr. Abernathy, it was as out of place as a flamingo on an iceberg. He was a man who checked his locks twice, who drew his curtains at precisely the same time every evening. An open door was simply not in his vocabulary. Mr. Abernathy, I called out, taking a tentative step onto his lawn. My voice sounded thin in the quiet of the late afternoon. The only response was the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. A prickle of unease traced its way down my spine. I walked up to the door and pushed it open a little further. "Hello? Mr. Abernathy, it's John from next door." The house was steeped in an unnerving silence. It wasn't an empty silence, it was a stopped silence, as if a clock had just ceased ticking. I took a hesitant step inside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of chicken noodle soup and old books. The kitchen was tidy, almost sterile, except for a single bowl on the small wooden table. It was half full of lukewarm soup, a spoon resting in the broth as if its user had been called away mid-bite. A half-empty glass of water sat beside it, beaded with condensation. "Mr. Abernathy." I called again, my voice now a nervous whisper. I felt like an intruder, a violator of this intensely private space, but my growing sense of dread was stronger than my sense of propriety. I moved cautiously through the downstairs area. The living room was a time capsule from the 1970s, with a perfectly fluffed armchair and a television set that looked ancient. A copy of National Geographic lay open on a footstool. Everything was in its place, yet the stillness was profoundly wrong. It felt like a stage set after the actors have suddenly vanished. I crept up the narrow staircase, each step creaking under my weight. His bedroom door was open. The bed was neatly made, the covers turned down in a way that suggested he was planning to return to it. His slippers were placed precisely parallel to each other on the rug. On the nightstand, a pair of reading glasses lay open on the pages of a thick hardcover book. He had simply been there, and then he wasn't. The feeling of unease had now blossomed into full-blown fear. This wasn't a man who had gone for a walk. This was a life interrupted. I backed out of the house, my heart hammering, and did a full circle of his property, calling his name until I was hoarse. I checked his small, shed-like garage. It was locked. I peered over his back fence into the woods beyond. Nothing. I decided the only logical thing to do was to go home and try calling his landline. Maybe he'd had a medical emergency and an ambulance had come while I was up the tree. As I crossed back into my own yard, my mind racing through possibilities, my gaze fell on the ladder still leaning against the oak. And that's when my blood turned to ice. Draped over the very top rung, almost perfectly camouflaged by the dense leaves, was a small scrap of dark fabric. It looked like it had been torn from a heavy wool coat. As I reached up to touch it, something glinted in the dappled sunlight. Wedged between the rung and the fabric was the small, pearl-handled pocketknife that Mr. Abernathy always, without fail, carried on a sheath on his belt. He was as attached to that knife as he was to his own hands. He would never have left it behind. Not like this. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The half-eaten soup, the open book, the abandoned knife. It was a constellation of wrongness. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. The police arrived, and the quiet afternoon was shattered by the crackle of radios and the slam of car doors. They treated it as a potential crime scene from the start. They cordoned off his house, searched it meticulously, and fanned out into the woods behind. They questioned me for hours. When did I borrow the ladder? What was my last conversation with him? Did he have any enemies? I told them everything I knew, which was precious little. He was a solitary man, a widower with no children and no family that I knew of. The investigation stretched on for days, then weeks. They found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no forced entry, no note. Mr. Abernathy had vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only the ghost of his last, unfinished moments. The police eventually took down the tape. They returned the ladder to me, saying it had been cleared by forensics and was no longer part of the investigation. For weeks, it sat leaned against the side of my garage, a towering aluminum monument to the unsettling mystery. Every time I looked at it, I felt a fresh wave of guilt and dread. It was the last thing he had touched, the last thing connecting him to the world before he disappeared. Life on the street slowly returned to normal, but for me, a shadow lingered. Mr. Abernathy's house remained dark and silent, a constant, nagging question mark at the edge of my vision. About a month later, a storm knocked a large branch onto my roof on the other side of my house. With a heavy heart, I knew I had to use Mr. Abernathy's ladder again. I dragged it out, the metal cold and strangely resonant in the quiet morning air. I pulled the rope to extend it, the section sliding apart with a loud series of clicks. As I tilted it up against the house, sunlight glinted off the rungs at just the right angle, and I saw it. On one of the upper rungs, the one just below where I'd found the knife, was an etching. It was crude, scratched frantically into the metal with something sharp, probably the tip of the very knife I'd found. The scratches were shallow, filled with grime, almost invisible unless you were looking for them. But they were there. 4 small desperate letters. HELP. My breath caught in my chest. I dropped the base of the ladder, and it clattered against the side of the house. I ran my fingers over the rough letters, the reality of the situation crashing down on me with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just vanished. He hadn't had a medical emergency. While I was up that tree, sawing branches, my neighbor had been just feet away, in mortal danger, trying to leave a final, desperate message on the one object he knew I would have to touch. I called the police again, my voice trembling. They came and took the ladder, this time with a new sense of urgency. The missing person case was officially reopened as a suspected abduction or homicide. They never found him. The ladder, his last message to the world, yielded no new clues. Mr. Abernathy is still gone. His house was eventually sold, its contents cleared out by a faceless estate company. New people live there now, people who mow the lawn and have barbecues, oblivious to the fact that they are living in a place where a life was violently interrupted. But I know, the ladder is gone, but the image of it is burned into my mind. And sometimes late at night, when the wind blows through the leaves of that old oak tree, I can almost hear a faint, metallic scraping sound. And if I listen hard enough, I can hear a whisper carried on that wind, a single, desperate word echoing from a moment I was too blind to see. Help.